and welcome to another edition of Middleware Friday for March 24th, 2017. This is episode 12, and today we're focusing on using API management to protect on-premise biztalk endpoints with Stef-Jan Wiggers. Stef-Jan has presented in a previous episode of the show, and I wanted to take the opportunity to bring him back and talk about this pattern that he's come up with. Also, as I was putting this content together, I realized that it was heavily influenced by our Dutch friends in the Netherlands. So today we're having a Middleware Friday Dutch edition. There's always some interesting things going on in the Netherlands with respect to integration. They've got a very good community over there, so I thought it was worth calling that out. So in addition to Stef-Jan's content, we're also going to talk about a recently released book called Robust Cloud Integration with Azure. This was published by Pact Publishing, and there's around 5 authors, and we'll call them out once we dive into that content. In addition, there was an interesting blog post by Heijs coming out of the Netherlands, and his blog is titled iPaaS Should Not Become Your Trojan Horse. So we'll take another look at that as well. So let's now dive into Stef-Jan's content.
Hi, I'm Stef-Jan Wiggers, and we're going to talk about using API management to protect an on-premise exposed endpoint from biztalk. So you can protect endpoints in biztalk using that relay through the .cf basic HTTP relay. So this could be pretty helpful if you want to expose or indirectly your SAP or other ERP systems using biztalk. So put biztalk in front of your ERP system. And having an API management can be interesting if you've already invested in a biztalk solution on top of your ERP system, and then you need that connectivity with the cloud. But you don't really want to move your biztalk installation into Azure because of the cost or do some other stuff. So this is a way of bringing your DMZ closer to the outside world or extend it a bit using that relay endpoint. So to make it more visible, I've created a demo for you guys. And it's depicted like this. So on the right hand side, you see biztalk, where I've set up a .cf basic HTTP relay adapter. So kind of put an address in to spin up that address and have that registered in the service bus. So that's a relay endpoint as depicted here. And then on top of that relay endpoint, at least in front of that relay endpoint, I kind of want to use or leverage API management to some of the security. So I could call my API, which route that to the relay endpoint, which will subsequently will route that through to biztalk, which can do any kind of magic towards your ERP system or an orchestration or something else, and then give you an answer back. So it can be one directional. In this case, it's bidirectional. It will give you an answer back. Okay, so let's look at the solution in general. So I've got a service bus set up as a service. And what's important is the connection string. The reason is that I'm going to use the policy name and the primary key. So those are pretty important for also my on-prem installation. In this case, for the relay endpoint I want to host up, because if I click on configure, you can see the address right here. And if you look at security, this is also where you put those credentials right in here. So that's kind of how it's set up on-prem. So this is just a relay endpoint, and behind that relay endpoint is an orchestration which just accepts a message which will be sent up there and give a response back saying, hey, thanks for in this case, it's an order. So this is my on-prem world. It's got that relay endpoint sitting there right nicely. It's running in a biztalk host instance, which means that it's registered. So, and I can check that using either Service Bus 360 or the Service Bus Explorer. As you can see here, the endpoint's right there. I can test it saying okay, and this is directly on the endpoint itself, and it will give me an answer back. But I also can do that using the calling the API. So I've created an API which is called my API, and that's got the DNS of the API management instance. But on the actual endpoint in this case is the relay endpoint that's generated from biztalk. It misses the order here, but that's being stuck onto as the operation. So it will be that total relay endpoint based on this, including the operation I want to carry out. And on top of that operation, I've got a policy. So I'll go to my API, order, and here you'll see the policy that's set on top of the operation, because before the API management can go actually to that endpoint, it needs some kind of authorization token. So that's put here in the header, and in the header I place the complete kind of token that's required to be able to call an endpoint. And the token is generated through a little tool I created, the service relay signature generator. It creates that address. Again, the credentials, similar credentials, or the same credentials I used in biztalk itself to set up the to be able to register that endpoint. I need the same kind of credentials here, including a token time to live. So how long is this token going to be valid? And that's going to be copied and right into here. So this is the whole policy setup. It's pretty straightforward. Then I go to the developer portal, and here you can see the payload I'm putting in, and that's content type text XML. Then I'm going to send that over to my API. And here you can see through the trace parts that this is kind of the exposed endpoint to the outside world, which I was calling Enterprise Azure API NAT order, and that's being rerouted to the backend. And this is also where the policy is being applied, where the header authorization be stuck on. And here you can also see the shared signature, and then it's routed to the backend. And then you can see the complete relay endpoint address, which was set up in biztalk, and it's routed to the backend, and that will give a response back, as you can see. So the response is right here, and it will just give you a status back. So that's kind of how this all is set up. So this is kind of my demo in a bird's overview. You can see me touch a little bit of stuff here and there, but the essence is basically that relay endpoint sitting there that can be called through API management, and that API itself can be further secured using OpenID or OAuth 2.0. So that's something you can do, and it's pretty interesting because you can do this in a couple of minutes, and then you got that set up instead of investing in moving your biztalk installation, or have your network guys come in and do all kinds of stuff with firewalls. So this is pretty easy. So you can set this up and do this. So there are some things you have to consider though. You have to think about, okay, this endpoint is hosted up in biztalk, so there's only one relay endpoint. So if you want to have more availability, then you have to kind of have two host instances on separate machines set up, pointing to that same address to have more high availability. The other aspect you have to think about is if you want to send up JSON instead of XML, then you have to convert that or using another policy too. And the other thing you have to think about, or from a management perspective, is that time to live token. So it's set up to, you saw me 35 minutes, but if you have set this up in a real life scenario, then those are kind of the aspects you have to really think about in terms of support. So what you see me talking about is having that relay endpoint set up in biztalk, then this simple kind of API definition and the API operation on top of it, or API policy, on top of that operation, so you can effectively call your relay endpoint from someone that wants to consume that relay endpoint for API management, and abstracting away a lot of the complexity using API management itself. Okay, thanks for listening.
So I hope you enjoyed that content from Steph Jan Wiggers. Thanks, Steph, for putting that together. I found it particularly interesting just because I've lived dealing with some of those scenarios where you need to expose connectivity to external users or other trading partners. And you don't want to move your biztalk platform into the DMZ. That's not considered a best practice. So you may be dependent upon other networking technologies like, say, an F5 load balancer that was essentially going to be a reverse proxy for you and forward on request. The problem in my experience is those are, number one, expensive solutions, especially if you don't have one to date, but they also could be fairly complex to configure. So if you can actually go ahead and expose that endpoint without involving other infrastructure folks, and you can still do it securely, I think that's a big win. I think another opportunity is to restify or provide some additional agility in your API layer, you can go ahead and do that, leave your BizTalk backend intact, and go ahead and do, say, JSON to XML conversions or XML to JSON conversions on the way back out in the response. So I think those are some other situations where you can actually leverage API management. Another one would be around caching. So say you had a fairly heavy request, maybe you are talking to a backend SAP system and you're just doing a GET. Well, as you know, that's a pretty expensive call to hit BizTalk and then hit the message box, hit up SAP, get the response, then provide it back. But if you're talking about master data, now you can go ahead and cache those responses and actually provide a very performant and snappy service to your caller. So all in all, I think it's a great pattern. I think it also addresses some of the challenges that do exist with API management and licensing. So today, if you have a premium tier of API management, you can actually use a VNet and VPN integration to bridge your cloud environment with your on-premise data center. But if you're using the standard tier, that's not an option for you. So this actually can be a pretty powerful pattern and does bridge some of those connectivity issues that do exist today. Next up, let's talk about a recently released book called Robust Cloud Integration with Azure. This book has been published by Pact Publishing, and I was incorrect when I said there was 5 authors. There's actually 6 authors. So we've got Mahendra, Abhishek, Gayanandra, Ashish, James, and Martin. Now what's interesting about this book is it's one of the first books that focuses on cloud integration as a whole. And if you look at some of the topics that they're writing about, they're looking at how to build your own connector, publish and manage it, build reliable and scalable workflows using Azure Logic Apps, simplifying SaaS connectivity with Azure Logic Apps, connect to your on-premise systems to Azure securely, and also how you can connect Logic Apps with on-premise line of business applications using Microsoft BizTalk Server. So definitely a lot of topics that are interesting, very cutting edge. It would have been actually quite challenging to write this book, knowing how much has changed with Azure and more specifically Azure Logic Apps in the last 8 to 10 months. So kudos to those guys for getting it across the line. Having written a few books myself, I know it is quite the journey and can be quite the grind. So congratulations. I do have a copy of this. I was able to take advantage of one of the earlier Pact sales. So I'm looking forward to reading this. Perhaps I'll open it up on an upcoming flight here. But for others, I encourage you to check it out. Now, the next piece of content I wanted to talk about was that blog and how iPaaS should not become your Trojan horse. So this is written by Heiss. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correct. Sorry if I'm not. And it is an interesting piece. And I think what intrigued me was I could relate to some of this. Now, there's no question with the introduction of integration platform as a service and SaaS applications in general. There's expectations that everything can happen much faster. And he makes a very good point where people are like, now we have a shorter time to market. Well, let's see it. Let's make it happen. And I guess the moral of the story here is that, just because something is fast, that also means that it's actually requires less time to make a mess as well. So just because you can move very quickly, you always want to ensure that you're moving quickly in the right direction. So guys provide some good advice here, including having a reference architecture for your hybrid cloud, which would include some principles such as how you're managing your passwords. Next, document the solution building blocks. Fully agree with the statement that Azure is a box of Legos. There's no question about that. But it is important to ensure people know the rules of the road and how they should go ahead and build these solutions using these Lego blocks. And more specifically, how do you ensure you're doing that securely? Hybrid cloud also requires hybrid service management. So oftentimes you'll have IT service management tools, perhaps ServiceNow or Remedy, and you're going to have configuration items within those platforms. It's also important to ensure that you have all of your cloud assets being recorded and managed in those systems as well. And lastly, Gijs is suggesting that you want to ensure you're using the building blocks in the right manner. And if you're not, it doesn't matter how whiz-bang the solution is if it's not going to address the requirements that were set out. So just a reminder that peer reviews, signed off solution designs, random inspections are all good things to do. Now, something that I like to do with my team is something called Engineering Fridays, which aligns with this. And it's really an opportunity for people to share some of the work that they've done in a non-threatening and very collaborative way. So I think we try to do this proactively, which allows people to share what they've been working on, but share at the right time. Don't share when it's too late. Once the system is already in production, that's too late. But if you can get ahead of this and have it in a way that encourages collaboration and learning, it can also be a big win for you as well. Next, I figured it's worth to call out what's coming soon. So these are some of the ideas that I'm thinking about. With the exception of the first one, the other ones are a little bit fluid. We'll see how it goes, but I've made some notes about following up on these activities. So as I've been chatting about for the last few weeks, there's the Global Integration Bootcamp. By the time you see this, the bootcamp will either be the following day or will have already passed us by. But something I'm planning on doing is doing some filming while I'm out in New York and actually including some of those highlights in an upcoming episode. I don't plan on recording entire sessions, but certainly I want to capture some of the information that's interesting. Also, there's been some work being done with API management. So for example, there's now support for SOAP, and they've also provided some other enhancements. So I think those are worth calling out. Also, BizTalk 2016, I haven't really talked too much about it on the show so far. Steph Jan did touch on it today. I think there's other things that we can talk about, like Logic App integration. And also, I get the feeling that Tord's got something up his sleeve, but he won't tell me any more details. But I'll definitely be keeping an eye on what he's got on the go. And lastly, also, I think there's been some investments made to Service Bus Relay, some changes there, which are also worth highlighting on an upcoming episode. Once again, feedback is welcome. Here's a couple channels that you can reach out to me at. Thanks again for watching. Thank you, BizTalk 360, for being a great partner of the show. I'll leave you with some credits. Thanks again, Steph Jan, for doing a great job and sharing your knowledge with us once again. Be sure to have you on a future episode. And lastly, I will leave you with the music credits.